He had a staff of 150 people. He wrote letters to British generals. He waited in a German naval academy for the Allies to come negotiate with him. Heinrich Himmler wasn't hiding. He was expecting a job offer. May 1945. The war is over. Nazi leaders are fleeing. Adolf Eichmann vanishes to Argentina. Josef Mengele escapes to South America. Klaus Barbie disappears into Bolivia. But Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, the head of the SS, one of the most wanted men in history, he doesn't run. Why would someone facing execution stay and wait to be caught? Was he insane, suicidal, or did he know something the other Nazis didn't? The answer is more disturbing than any of those options. But first, you need to understand what the Nazis who escaped actually did. May 8th, 1945. Germany has surrendered. Hitler is dead. The war is over. At this moment, thousands of Nazi officials are using Ratline's secret escape networks, providing false documents, safe houses, and passage to South America. Adolf Eichmann, the administrator of the Holocaust, gets fake papers as Otto Henninger and reaches Argentina in 1950. He lives there for a decade before Mossad finds him in 1960. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor, escapes to Argentina as Helmut Gregor in 1949. He later moves to Brazil and dies in 1979 without ever being captured. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, gets help from U.S. intelligence and escapes to Bolivia in 1951. These men understood they were war criminals. They knew they had to disappear or die. Heinrich Himmler had better resources than all of them, better connections, more money, more followers who could help him vanish. So why didn't he use them? Why did he stay? Here's where it gets disturbing. Himmler wasn't staying because he was trapped. He was staying because he thought he had a meeting scheduled. But with who? And what made him think they'd ever show up? Himmler genuinely believed he was indispensable, that the Western Allies would need him after the war, that his SS would be essential to maintain order against the Soviets. This wasn't desperate hope. This was his actual plan. In late April 1945, while Hitler was still alive in the bunker, Himmler secretly contacted Count Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish diplomat. He tried to negotiate surrender, but only to the Western Allies, not the Soviets. He actually believed he could negotiate terms, that he'd be the Allies' confidence man in Europe, that they'd see him as a practical partner rather than a war criminal. When Hitler discovered this betrayal in his final days, he was furious. He stripped Himmler of all positions and ordered his arrest. But Hitler was dying and powerless. The regime was finished. After Hitler's death on April 30th, Himmler went to Flensburg in northern Germany. And what he did there is so absurd, so detached from reality, that when, as I tell you, you won't believe it's real. Remember, this is after Hitler's death, after Germany's surrender, while other Nazis are burning their uniforms and fleeing to South America. What was Himmler doing? He set up an office with 150 staff members, complete with radio communications and a motor pool. He wasn't hiding. He was running a government department, waiting for the Allies to call. He tried to offer himself as second in command to Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's successor. Dönitz repeatedly rejected him. Dönitz even offered Himmler false papers to help him escape. Himmler didn't take them. He stayed. He waited. And then he did something even more pathetic, something so delusional it's almost hard to believe. He started writing letters to one of the most famous British generals of World War II. What did those letters say? And did he ever get a response? While waiting in Flensburg, Himmler wrote letters to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, trying to negotiate, trying to establish contact, trying to set up a meeting. Montgomery never replied, not once. But Himmler kept sending a man to check for responses, every day, waiting for acknowledgement that never came. Picture this, the architect of the Holocaust, sending letters like a job applicant, waiting to hear back about an interview. And when the responses never came, he apparently couldn't understand why. Maybe the letters weren't getting through. Maybe Montgomery was too busy. Maybe he needed a different approach. It never occurred to him that Montgomery wasn't interested in negotiating with the man who orchestrated genocide. By mid-May, even Himmler finally realized something was wrong. The letters weren't working. The negotiations weren't happening. So he made a decision. Not to flee to Argentina. Not to disappear like the other Nazis. What he did instead would seal his fate. And it involved one of the most incompetent disguises in history. Himmler put together a disguise. He shaved his mustache. He wore an eye patch. He dressed as a regular soldier and carried papers identifying him as Heinrich Himmler, a member of the secret field police. Here's the problem. Himmler's face was one of the most recognizable in Germany. He'd been photographed thousands of times. His image was on posters, in newspapers, in propaganda films. Every Allied soldier had been shown what he looked like. Shaving his mustache and wearing an eye patch was like a modern celebrity trying to go incognito with just sunglasses, pathetically inadequate. But it gets worse. Those papers that fake identity had one fatal flaw. The Germans themselves had accidentally created the perfect trap. The stamp on those papers. It was about to hand Himmler directly to his captors. How? What was wrong with that stamp? Here's the irony that should have gone viral decades ago. British intelligence had already identified that specific secret field police unit stamped the GFP as being used by fleeing SS officers. The Germans themselves had created a fake identity that guaranteed extra scrutiny. Himmler chose literally the one identity that would make him more suspicious, not less. The Nazis' own stamp exposed him. It's like he put a sign on his forehead saying, "Please investigate me extra carefully." On May 21, 1945, Himmler and two companions approached a British checkpoint at Bremervörde in northern Germany. What happened next would be almost comical if it weren't so dark, because even after being caught, even after being detained, Himmler still didn't understand what was happening. He thought this was all going to work out, right up until the moment it didn't. The British soldiers immediately became suspicious. Three nervous men traveling together with secret field police papers, exactly what they're looking for. They're detained. At first, Himmler maintains his disguise. He insists he's Heinrich Himmler, but the British aren't buying it. They separate the men. They begin more intensive questioning. They move them between camps over the next 2 days. And here's what's remarkable. Even after being detained, Himmler apparently remained calm, almost expectant. Witnesses later said he seemed like he thought this would get sorted out once the right person arrived. On May 23rd, he's brought to a camp in Lüneburg. The questioning intensifies, and finally, Himmler makes his revelation. He says just 3 words. 3 words he clearly thought would change everything. 3 words he believed would finally get him the meeting he'd been waiting for. What did he say, and what happened when he said it? "I am Heinrich Himmler." He apparently expected this to change his treatment, that they'd bring in senior officers to negotiate, that his importance would finally be recognized. Instead, the British immediately prepare to move him to higher-level interrogation for war crimes. And it's only then, only in that moment, that reality crashes in. There would be no negotiation, no cooperation, no recognition of his supposed indispensability. He was going to be tried at Nuremberg and then executed. Himmler had one last move, one last way to maintain control. And what happened in those final moments was violent, desperate, and exactly what you'd expect from someone who just watched their entire delusion collapse. The British ordered a medical examination. Captain Wells approached to check Himmler's mouth for hidden poison. Himmler bit down on the doctor's fingers while simultaneously crushing a cyanide capsule he'd hidden in his mouth. The guards immediately reacted. In the words of one witness, they upended the old bastard and shoved his mouth into a bowl of water, trying to make him spit out the poison. But it was too late. The cyanide was already working. Within 15 minutes, Heinrich Himmler was dead. According to witnesses, even in those final moments, he showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the millions he'd murdered, just defiance and self-justification as the poison took effect. His body was photographed for identification. The images show a man who looks older than his 44 years, gaunt, defeated. Nothing like the powerful SS leader who once commanded absolute terror. And then the British made a decision about his body. Here's the final twist, the ending that's almost poetic in its dark irony. Where is Heinrich Himmler buried? Nobody knows. And that's exactly the point. The British buried Himmler's body in an unmarked grave somewhere near Lüneburg. The exact location was kept secret to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. To this day, nobody knows exactly where Heinrich Himmler is buried. Think about that for a moment. The man who sent millions of Jews, Roma, disabled people, and countless others to mass graves now lies in an anonymous hole in the ground somewhere in Germany. and nobody, not even historians, knows exactly where. He wanted to be indispensable, remembered, important, essential to the post-war order. Instead, his location is literally unknown. He's buried in secrecy specifically so nobody can find him. No memorial, no marker, no recognition whatsoever. But here's the question that haunts historians. How does someone become this delusional? How do you convince yourself the people hunting you want to hire you? The psychology explains everything, and it's not just about Himmler. Why couldn't Himmler see what was obvious to everyone else? Why did he think the Allies would work with the architect of genocide? 3 psychological factors destroyed his ability to perceive reality. First, grandiose narcissism. Himmler's entire identity was built on being essential, the powerful head of the SS, the man who got things done, the indispensable enforcer of the Nazi regime. The idea that he was actually worthless to the Allies, that they saw him as nothing but a war criminal to hang, was literally incomprehensible to his mind. It contradicted everything his self-image was built on. Second, ideological blindness. Himmler genuinely believed in Nazi ideology. He thought the SS represented order, discipline, and strength. He believed the Western Allies would recognize they needed these qualities against the Soviet threat. He couldn't grasp that what he saw as strength, the world saw as genocidal cruelty. The ideological filter distorted everything. Third, the echo chamber. Everyone around Himmler either believed his delusions or was too afraid to contradict him. His staff of 150 people wasn't telling him, "You're delusional, get to Argentina now." They were enabling his fantasy, discussing negotiation strategies, planning for a future where Himmler played a role in post-war Germany. If even one person had been honest, had said, "They're going to hang you at Nuremberg, your only chance is to disappear," he might have survived. But surrounded by enablers, he never got that reality check, and it killed him. And here's what should terrify you. This pattern didn't die with Himmler. There are leaders alive today making the exact same miscalculations, believing they're indispensable when they're actually expendable, surrounded by enablers, isolated from reality. This pattern appears throughout history with authoritarian leaders. They become so isolated in power, so surrounded by enablers, so convinced of their own importance that they lose all ability to assess reality. Saddam Hussein apparently believed until nearly the end that his forces would prevail or that the Americans would negotiate with him. He couldn't conceive of being captured, tried, and executed. Muammar Gaddafi seemed genuinely shocked that his people had turned against him. He'd convinced himself he was beloved. This isn't just bad judgment. It's the psychological effect of absolute power combined with ideological fanaticism. It creates a filter that distorts all information until the person becomes incapable of seeing what's actually happening. Himmler is perhaps the most extreme example because he had weeks to plan, ample resources, clear evidence the Allies weren't interested, and he still couldn't see reality. His delusion was so complete that he maintained an office with 150 staff members while supposedly fleeing. He wrote unanswered letters while time ran out. He chose a disguise that guaranteed his capture. Every decision was catastrophically wrong, and he never saw it coming. So why didn't Heinrich Himmler flee Germany like other Nazi leaders? Because he genuinely believed the Allies would work with him, because his narcissism made him think he was essential, because his ideology prevented him from understanding how the world saw him, and because everyone around him enabled these delusions instead of confronting him with truth. He had every resource to escape. Better connections than Eichmann, more money than Mengele, more loyal followers than Barbie. Instead, he stayed. He maintained an office. He wrote letters that were never answered. He put on a pathetic disguise. He got captured at a checkpoint, and he died by cyanide before facing trial. The man who orchestrated the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others died believing he'd been misunderstood. That history would eventually recognize he'd been doing what was necessary. And today, he lies in an unmarked grave, somewhere in Germany. Location unknown, no memorial, no marker, anonymous forever. The architect of mass graves got one of his own, and nobody knows where it is. Nobody cares. Nobody remembers anything about him except the horror he caused. That's not justice, but it's the ending his delusion created. Himmler thought he was indispensable. He died in an unmarked grave, location unknown. What other delusional dictators sealed their own fate? Let me know what you want covered next. Subscribe to the Dictator Lab for more deep dives into the psychology of power.